Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I feel like it's been a long time, strangely, but here I am, and here you are. I am your host, Annika, and before we get started today, I just want to give a big, huge thank you to the sponsors of the show. I guess sponsors. I feel like y'all on Patreon are definitely well deserved to be called sponsors of the show by now. You know who you are, so big shout out. If you have a chance, please go check it out. Link will be in the description of this show. So, yes, thank you so much for being a part of the driving force of this show. Okay, moving on. So, today's episode, it's going to be one hell of an ironic one because I am going to be talking about secrecy and sorcery, particularly secrecy um, of the craft and keeping your craft a secret. Mostly. I'll definitely get into the weeds, but I think this actually deserves a spot in the sun for a moment. I want to talk about why it matters, why it has always mattered, and what the historical traditions actually say about it because they say a lot. And most of it never makes it to the mainstream witchcraft conversation for really quite obvious reasons. But we're going to be talking about the Greek magical papyri, about the grimoire traditions, about even folk magic practices across cultures, and what all of these sources understood about silence. And, they seem to have collectively been maybe forgotten, or at least the reason for secrecy has been a little bit muddled or lost in the wind of mainstream media and witchcraft because really nowadays we want to put everything out there. But I want to shift our focus back to the wonderful act of being this sort of secret, cunning witch. So even the conversation of what happens when you break secrecy, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and perhaps your spirits and what deities or allies and this realm of magic. What I do want to be clear about is this episode of secrecy is not about shame. It's not the same thing. I'll definitely get into that, but let's kick things off by talking about Eliphas Levi and the four powers of the Magus. So, in Transcendental Magic, Levi writes, to attain the knowledge and power of the Magi, there are four indispensable conditions: an intelligence illuminated by study, an intrepidity which nothing can check, all will which cannot be broken, and a prudence which nothing can corrupt and nothing intoxicate. To know, to dare, to will, to keep silence. Such are the four words of the Magus, inscribed upon the four symbolical forms of the Sphinx. So to know, we study, right? We research, we read and learn and dive into theory. To will, we talk about this intention. We begin this transmutation from knowledge to molding and breathing something into life by imbuing ourselves into it with purpose. And we direct our energy and start to hone in this focus. Then to dare, you birth the thing into life, right? And push it to the edges, commit to the workings and the rites and the rituals, and then silence, to keep silence. This gets tacked on like a little bit of a footnote, but it is not to be dismissed. Historically, in traditions that took this framework pretty seriously, the fourth pillar wasn't an afterthought. It was the capstone. It was the thing that held the other three in place. And without silence, the other three would collapse. Without silence, your knowledge leaks and your will disperses and your daring becomes performance. So Levi himself wrote about this with real weight, right? He understood silence not as a social nicety or a safety precaution, but as a fundamental magical principle. And that's what I really want to talk about here, the container that holds the charge. And, we can think about it in terms of basic physics. So, pressure requires containment, steam requires a sealed vessel. The moment you open that valve, that pressure releases, the energy starts to disperse, and what was building toward something dissipates into the air. So, the logic of this magic is the same. The moment you open your mouth and let the working out before it's done, before it's manifested, before it's complete, you've opened the valve, you've released the pressure, and what was building towards something real disperses into conversation, into other people's opinions, into the energetic noise of what's being witnessed. And this is very much like a concern of the evil eye traditions, right? Sometimes it feels like when you have this great idea and all of a sudden you start to talk about it, nothing comes from it, or something squashes it, or it doesn't turn out. And this obviously doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough to where you will notice it. And this isn't just Levi's idea. This isn't just Western ceremonial magic. This principle shows up across traditions with remarkable consistency. And I think that consistency is telling us something important. So, when we talk about silence in Hermetic magic, we are not talking about mere secrecy or ancient or aesthetic mystique. And by all means, I'm not a ceremonial working witch, but while I do love to learn about it and implement it into my practice where I can, we're talking about this disciplined spiritual technology, right? In the three books of occult philosophy, Donald Tyson summarizes five traditional Hermetic reasons for silence, drawn directly from the Greek Hermetic texts such as the Corpus Hermeticum and the Asclepius, which I find entirely fascinating and worth sitting on. So let's go through them. So the first reason described is that sharing holy matters with profane minds pollutes them. This emphasizes that the mere presence of the wrong audience disrupts this sanctity of the transmission. So, this sacred knowledge is spiritually alive. It is something that can be polluted. This idea of improper reception was believed to degrade its power, if you will, its potency, right? So, back to like sharing your ideas before they're manifested, it loses its power. And this in turn supports the teaching that the environment itself needed to be ritually pure. And this is not meant to be this elitism, at least I think, but it reflects some, Mediterranean religious logic where holiness is contagious. But so is profanation. And we need, or we do see this in multiple cultures, of course. And this is why later Western esoteric orders, including the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, required graded initiation and oath bound secrecy. So, reason two for secrecy is that profane minds cannot grasp holy doctrine, mock those who preach it, and are incited by it to a greater evil. So, this obviously takes more of a psychological angle where it warns that the many, quote, many, just simply cannot grasp this doctrine and will in turn respond in a more animal way, I guess, so full of this ridicule and this hostility, this moral distortion. This is very common just to see in humans who don't understand something. It in turn kind of makes them frustrated, right? And it makes them act out. And, you know, this distortion, a struggle to understand in turn becoming hostile. So Tyson cites the passage from the Stobaean Hermetica, where Hermes warns that sacred teaching can actually push bad men towards worse wickedness. And of course, this is remarkably nuanced, but it's interesting to say the least, right? So I think this tradition really recognizes something modern psychology can confirm. People interpret information through their existing structure, and advanced teachings can rather destabilize them than actually elevate them. Partial understanding can inflate this ego or justify this harmful behavior. And Hermetic teachers were deeply concerned about misapplication of gnosis. So, this is one reason magical traditions repeatedly stress preparation and purification in this gradual initiation, not just this information dumping. So, reason three is for silence allows the divine enlightenment of the doctrine to occur. Hermes instructs the student to keep solemn silence so divine mercy may descend. This silence is not defensive, but more of a receptive technology. The silence illuminated a prepared mind, and this stillness creates permeability. So, the fourth reason is simply the futility of attempting to express the inexpressible. This is the apophatic core of Hermeticism. So goes on to cite the Hermetic fragment, stating that the supreme God is beyond the power of human declaration. Quote, "For there is, my son, a secret doctrine full of holy wisdom concerning him who alone is Lord of all and preconceived God, whom to declare is beyond the power of man." End quote. So finally, the fifth involves a proscription against translation of the doctrines into other languages because the words themselves are holy and embody power. So words are not these arbitrary symbols, the sound actually participates in reality. So words have meaning and the vibration carries this efficacy. So no matter how you want the cookie crumbled, there's one practical thing Hermeticism is quietly teaching here. Its silence is not about being secretive to look mysterious. It's about protecting fragile inner states and preventing premature discharge of this intention and creating the mental pressure where real transformation can occur. Okay, so let's jump into the Greek magical papyri because it gets specific, right? Woven throughout these texts again and again are instructions about secrecy. So, one of the most striking things about the PGM is how often the texts explicitly instruct the practitioner to keep the working secret. Phrases like keep it secret, tell no one, or guard this carefully appear throughout the collection with, a frequency that makes clear this wasn't optional advice. Now, obviously, it doesn't directly translate to that, but it is very similar. And it was considered really essential to the efficacy of the working itself. One of the most famous examples appears right at the beginning of PGM 1. So, in the ritual for acquiring a supernatural assistant known as a paridros. The Greek word literally means the one who sits beside, or I think it's like a servant of God or something, which already tells you a lot about how this spirit was understood. This is not a distant God you pray to once and never hear from again. This is framed as an ongoing magical ally, something that stays close to the practitioner, appears in dreams, gives information, and helps carry out magical aims, essentially a familiar. And it's intimate in structure, even if the text itself stays very matter of fact about it. Of course, this is very akin to what we experience today as magical sorcerers if we choose to engage in these sort of spirit relationships or even servitors. Many spirits have demand for some sort of level of secrecy. Now, PGM 13, which contains a lengthy cosmological text and associated rituals, includes the instruction that the text itself should be hidden, kept in a safe place, not displayed, not left where others might read it. The physical document is treated as a magical object on its own right, and its concealment is part of its power. One of the most consistent features of the PGM is the use of hidden names. So, names of gods, spirits, and powers that are written in ways that obscure them, that encode them, essentially, that make them readable only to the initiated. There are names written in cipher, names written backwards, names broken up and scattered throughout the text, names that appear to be nonsense syllables to the uninitiated but carry specific power for those who actually know how to read them. The logic here is deeply practical. If you know the true name of a power, you have a handle on it. You can invoke it, direct it, work with it. But that also means if someone else knows the name you're using, they have a handle on your working and they can interfere with it, they can redirect it, and they can manipulate it. They can use that knowledge against you. So these hidden names in the PGM are actually this form of magical encryption. The practitioner is the one who knows the key. I think some people have actually, you know, suggested about these magical names and texts were deliberately designed to be untranslatable. Their power came precisely from the fact that they couldn't be reduced to ordinary language and they existed in a space between human speech and divine communication. And that exact liminal quality was part of what makes them effective. So, if you could translate them, if you could explain them, if you could reduce them to just ordinary words, they would lose something. And that mystery was part of the mechanism. So, of course, then there are instructions to destroy, not just keep a secret, but to destroy the evidence, if you will. This is where the silence is sort of transformed, it's alchemized. In several places throughout the PGM, practitioners are instructed to destroy the written record of a working after it's been performed. Clearly, many of us still do this today. Burn the papyrus, dissolve it in water, return it to the earth. The working is done. The knowledge has been used, and now the physical evidence needs to disappear. We even see this instruction of dissolving these written spells in water and then drinking the water, literally consuming the knowledge, taking it into the body where it can't be accessed by anyone else. The written words becomes flesh. The external record becomes this actually internal knowledge. Like literally, the vulnerability of the written document is eliminated by, making the practitioner themselves the only repository. And we do talk a little bit more about consumption of actual materia in my, I believe it was the Sin Eaters episode. So if you want, please look over there after this one. But there's a different angle to dissect here because, it's the instructions to misdirect. And there's been well over hundreds of other texts and instructions about this whole misdirecting thing. So to tell people almost, they're doing something other than what they're actually doing, to create this false trail, to make their magical activity look like something mundane and unremarkable. We'll get into this further, but within the PGM, the PGM-4 contains a passage where the practitioner is advised to conceal the true name of their activities from household members and from neighbors. If asked what they're doing, they should have a plausible, mundane explanation ready, and the magical work should be invisible to casual observation. So, this is not considered unethical in the context of these texts. It's considered prudent. It's considered part of the craft. The practitioner who can make their magical work invisible, who can move through the world without leaving a magical footprint, at least one that's not visible to the muggles out there, but who can redirect the attention of curious eyes toward something harmless. That practitioner is safer, more effective, and more powerful than one who works in plain sight. So, over time, I have learned that I can trust what it is I do with some, close friends and family, of course, but it never goes beyond I practice or it's claiming I have a living practice or am simply just witchy or saying I'm a witch or just claiming that title. Even, they're open to ask more questions if they want to, but it usually just stays at that. Even out and about, gathering materia, there is no feeling of I have to hide and create this merely mundane cover for what I am doing out of shame, but for a greater purpose for the magic itself. Secrecy, when wielded by the practitioner, is always potent. Now, don't get me wrong here. I have been known to just pull a little vessel out of my purse and collect some materia, dirt, whatever it may be, with no shame at some points, but uh, you know, that's besides this point. Okay, so if we fast forward a little bit to our lovely little books of great grimoires, the Key of Solomon, the Sworn Book of Honoris, the Picatrix, the Lesser Key of Solomon, the Book of Ebermelin, they were not meant to be widely distributed. They were meant to be copied by hand, one copy at a time, passed from a single teacher to a single student. The transmission itself being part of the consecration of the knowledge, getting your hands on these, a single page even, was a big, big deal. So within the Key of Solomon, it opens with very clear instructions about secrecy and careful transmission. The text presents itself as the wisdom of King Solomon passed down through a controlled lineage. And right from the beginning, the reader is warned not to treat the material casually. In the Mather's Classic translation, the reader is instructed, "Thou shalt preserve this book with great care and communicate it unto no one." Other manuscript traditions carry similar warnings, often stressing that the book should only be given to someone who is worthy, obedient, and properly prepared. The concern here is very practical. Powerful operations require disciplined operators. And importantly, the text does actually explain why. In the prologue and early chapters, the reader is warned that divine and magical mysteries must not be exposed to the ignorant or the profane, because misuse leads to failure and disorder. The underlying logic here is very consistent to what we see in the Greek magical papyri. Magical knowledge is treated as something that can be weakened. It can be distorted and or rendered ineffective through careless handling. There are also very concrete instructions for the physical care of the book itself. In I think several manuscript, the book itself is to be wrapped in this clean or consecrated cloth, stored in a pure place, and handled ritually. One commonly cited instruction actually reads, "Thou shalt wrap the book in silk and keep it clean and in a pure place." So obviously, this is telling it is what it says. The book is not treated as mere information, it is treated as a ritual object, something that carries force by virtue of what it contains and how it's handled. In that sense, the grimoire itself becomes part of the magical apparatus. And I do know this is very common in even today's ceremonial magical spaces. Okay, so actually in the Sworn Book of Honorius takes, principle of secrecy and turns the intensity up significantly. So, according to the text's own origin story, the book was compiled by a gathering of magicians who feared the loss or persecution of their knowledge. Whether historically literal or not, the framing is pretty clear. This is endangered, restricted material that must be tightly controlled. So, before receiving or working the material, the practitioner is expected to swear to proper use and secrecy, sort of carrying this lineage of needing this text to stay very secret. In one widely cited passage, the text warns that the operator must be faithful, discreet, and secret, almost initiating them, or I would say the practitioner itself, into sort of that circle of magicians who feared their knowledge would be lost. And the consequences of failure are actually made very explicit. The text repeatedly suggests that improper use or broken vows will result in loss of spiritual cooperation. And in some versions, the warning is really starkly phrased along the lines that the spirits will no longer obey the operator who is impure or disobedient. Now, of course, it doesn't always frame this as the knowledge literally turning against the magician in a dramatic curse-like way, or maybe it does, but it does clearly state that, the efficacy of the operations depends on the moral and behavioral integrity of the practitioner, including their ability to keep the work contained. So by the time we reach the Picatrix, you know, once it is translated into Latin, the emphasis on discretion has been, almost psychological in its sophistication. So the text is very clear that not everyone is suited to magical work. Clearly, we are seeing a theme here. The Latin in the Latin Picatrix, the ideal magician is described as someone who, again, is secretive about his affairs and discreet in speech. So this really feeds into like the modern idea of the witch being this mysterious, very secretive person. This is not presented as mere personality flavor, but it's framed more like a functional requirement at this point. The magician must be someone capable of containment, someone who does not scatter their attention or expose their workings carelessly. Now, just a quick do over on the Book of Abramelin. This operation requires the practitioner to actually withdraw from normal social life, to dedicate themselves entirely to the work, and to maintain absolute secrecy about what they're doing. The text is very precise that the operation will fail if the practitioner reveals what they are doing to others. You know, might not fail, but it will fail. The secrecy is a non-negotiable in this condition. The spirits involved in the operation require it. The magical process depends on it, and the container of silence is what makes the transformation actually possible. Now, obviously, if drawing inspiration from these texts, completely isolating yourself is, well, I'll leave it at not recommended. It is a 15th century text for a reason. But overall, when it comes to learning from these grimoires, There is a sophisticated understanding of what we might call the ecology of magical knowledge. So, knowledge doesn't exist in a vacuum, it exists in relationship with the practitioner who holds it, with the tradition that generated it, with the spirits and powers that are invoked through it. And there is a way of seeing magic as a spirit itself when it comes to keeping it a secret. It is not this knowledge that you choose to keep away from others to gatekeep it or because you simply don't want them learning it. But once you are initiated into the life of a witch or the life of a magical person, you enter this relationship with magic itself. It becomes embodied and it becomes something that can be harmed, it can be polluted, it can be disrupted, and its power can be taken away if not protected from from certain measures. Now, this is why when I think about the ceremonial and the grimoire traditions is, they're so insistent on this proper transmission for just this reason. And even in folk magic and, these traditions where you are not initiated, but you are brought on by your mentor, you are taught from, centuries of this oral um, language and these oral traditions of magic itself. So that's where we get into the folky shit because I think, this is where the principle of secrecy becomes, almost more visceral, more practical. And at least for me in my practice, so when it comes to the more folk magic approach to this silence and keeping secret of your magics, speaking to freely about working where you're working, especially before results manifest, is, widely regarded as one of the most reliable ways to weaken or spoil it. In traditional logic, a work gains strength through focused intention, right? Repetition and containment. And idle talk disperses that focus. The directed current becomes scattered and the work starts to lose pressure. And, this is really the same mechanics from the grimoires of much older times. But there is this one well known proverb that I've heard, especially in like conjure spaces and definitely just general Southern vernacular, but a closed mouth catches no flies. And this definitely carries a very specific magical weight, right? Your mouth is treated as an opening, a literal point of energetic exchange, and what leaves through speech is understood to affect what returns. When you expose a working prematurely, you create opportunities for this interference, this opposition or reversal. So sometimes this could lead to sort of like a witch battle, right? So if someone has learned a working or something has been laid on them, especially if the methods have been revealed or materials, if that is something that they can find, they can seek uncrossing or reversals from another practitioner. And now that worker's magic is coming for your magic, and well, now you're in a bit of this battle. And this is why experienced workers, have often been remarkably tight-lipped, not out of shame, not out of this moral hesitation, but because secrecy is understood to be a part of the mechanism itself. So when it comes to the more cliche, cunning person at the end of town or little old woman in the witch house who lives on the hill, which is actually very historically rooted, these people who would practice on behalf of their community, right? I think it's really important to know that, everyone in the village knew who the cunning person was. Their identity itself wasn't secret, their general function wasn't secret, but the specifics of their work, the ingredients, the methods, the words spoken, the spirits called, those were all kept safely closed behind doors. And this is different in a way where not just the practitioner or the work itself is kept a secret, but just the work. The identity was not hidden. And often these workers, these cunning folk, would frame their work in ways that sounded completely ordinary to outsiders. They might describe an operation as a remedy, a blessing, or a prayer rather than explicitly calling it magic. Because, I mean, really, even back then, even calling something magic, if you were practicing magic, it was still believed to be evil, but that's besides the point. To the community, to the village itself, it sounded like folk medicine or pious Christian practice, but to the clients familiar with the tradition, the meaning was perfectly clear. So the historian, actually Owen Davies, in his influential book Cunning Folk, Popular Magic in English History, documents multiple cases showing how these practitioners controlled information actually very carefully. Davies notes that cunning folk frequently gave clients highly specific ritual instructions while withholding the theoretical explanation behind them. The client was expected to follow directions precisely, not to intellectually dissect the mechanism. So, for example, they might be told visit a crossroads at a particular hour or deposit coins, pins, or bread at a boundary place, perform a prayer a fixed number of times, or carry a buried object, or carry and go bury this object in a prescribed way. So the magical reasoning is often absent from the client facing instruction. Practitioner maintained this interpretive authority, the power, in a sense, stayed with the cunning person. And Davies actually explicitly observes that many cunning folk cultivated an aura of specialized knowledge that was not fully shared with clients. This was partly professional protection, maintaining status and mystique, but it also reflects this broader magical worldview in which too much explanation could weaken or invite interference. So, we also see evidence of deliberate linguistic softening. In court records and folklore accounts, practitioners frequently describe their work using Christianized or medical language when speaking publicly. So, charms were framed as prayers, right? Spirit work was framed as blessing. Magical diagnosis was framed as discovering the cause of illness. In a post Reformation world where accusations of witchcraft could be, of course, dangerous, ambiguity was protective. There's a long standing belief in many North American folk traditions that certain knowledge only stays potent when it moves person to person. So, voice to ear, breath to breath, relationship to relationship. Once something is fixed permanently on paper, it changes. It becomes too available, too exposed, too easy for the wrong eyes to land on it without context or permission. And this really is where the transmission itself is a part of magic. So, this oral tradition, it's not just information transfer, it's an activation. When knowledge passes under the right conditions, the right trust, the right timing, the right emotional and spiritual readiness, something subtle but very real is believed to sort of wake up in the person receiving it. So, actually, these rules about transmission, who can pass what to whom and when, of course, weren't random superstition. There are ways of containing this power so it doesn't become thin and scattered. So, in more like Appalachian healing traditions, it shows up pretty clearly in the practice often called talking off or trying. So there's something called talking off or trying, and these are like spoken charms used to stop things like bleeding or cool burns and remove warts and really address other ailments. And of course, the actual words of these charms are not revealed. They're often very guarded very closely, but it's almost like saying, I can talk off a burn. So, of course, in a traditional sense, when this is passed on, throughout your community or from even your mentor, your grandmother, your mother, whoever it is, it takes time. And these words are not shared carelessly or publicly. Otherwise, they would stop working. So then there are the actual mechanisms of almost secrets, right? So, like when you tell a person a secret, you whisper in their ear. So, what's very interesting is I believe this stems from Slavic tradition, but where you actually whisper charms so quietly that the person being healed can't even make out the words. So, in this case, maybe a patient might feel the healer's breath on their skin, might hear the rhythm of the words, but the actual content remained secret. The healing happened through the words, but the words themselves were protected. And so this whispered magic connects to, a broader understanding of the voice as a magical instrument. Your voice carries power. The words you speak have force, and that force can be directed, whispered into a specific space, spoken into a specific object, a vessel, breathed onto a specific person, or it can be scattered. It can be dispersed into the air where anyone might catch it. So when it comes to secrecy and your spirits or spirits you work with in general, this is a very alive thing to see. So when communicating with certain spirits themselves, you know, this information may need to be withheld from others or even what you discuss, what they teach you, um, whether it's what your tradition that you are following calls for or not. One of the most interesting patterns is this spirit given knowledge. And I love talking about this because, of course, it's happened to me. And it's like at first it can be a little bit frustrating, but you really realize there's more to it. And this is kind of like an incomplete recipe. So the working that comes to you with all the steps, but without explanation. You know what to do, you know the ingredients, the timing, the sequence, but you don't know why it works. The reasoning is withheld. And this might seem like a limitation at first, but I want to suggest that it's actually a protection. If you don't know why it works, if you can't explain the mechanism, you can't articulate the logic, can't reconstruct this theory, then the knowledge can't be fully extracted from you. You can share the recipe, but you can't share the understanding that makes the recipe truly functional. The spirit itself has given you the tool, but the blueprint. So when a spirit gives you knowledge, this recipe, a working, even a name, a technique, they're giving you something of value, something that, of course, has power. And in the economy of magical relationships, gifts of power come with obligations. And the obligation might be regular offerings, it might be specific behaviors, it might be the use of the knowledge only in certain ways or for certain purposes. And one of the most common obligations is this secrecy. So, of course, when you try to look at it from, the spirit's perspective, if you share the knowledge they gave you, if you put it out into the world where anyone can access it, you've given away something that was theirs to give. You've made a decision about their knowledge that wasn't yours to make. You've potentially put their name, their methods, their power into context that, they didn't choose and can't control. The spirit gave it to you in the context of your relationship with the expectation that you would handle it appropriately. Or the fact that it isn't even complete knowledge yet. They could give you pieces little bit by little bit, feeding it to you in parts. So when you work with a recipe you don't fully understand, you're required to trust that it just works, right? There is a reason for that ingredient or that offering. It's asking for you, but you might just not know why. And you're required to maintain the relationship with the spirit who gave it to you because they're the one who holds the understanding. So, other than it just being like a protective measure, this is actually this form of like spiritual pedagogy. The spirit isn't withholding information out of stinginess or cruelty. They are creating a structure that ensures ongoing relationship, ongoing learning, and ongoing development. If they gave you everything at once, the recipe and the understanding, you might not need them anymore, right? The incomplete transmission keeps the relationship alive and growing. And, another pattern that actually shows up across this sort of like spirit knowledge is this burst of inspiration. That the working that comes to you suddenly, fully formed in a moment of clarity or a dream or trance, and then fades, or the spirit communicates to you directly what the fuck it wants, right? Is moving you and manipulating you for what it is you have asked. You act on it in the moment, and afterward, you couldn't reconstruct it even if you tried. The spirit gave you what you needed when you needed it, and then again took it back. This is like just in time magical knowledge, right? You receive it, you use it, and then it's gone. Not because you failed to remember it, but because it was never meant to be permanent and it was meant for that moment, that situation, that specific need. The spirit calibrated the transmission to the requirement. Now, dream transmissions also fall here because, they are particularly common in this category. You can receive these recipes, these instructions, these warnings, and guidance in dreams, sometimes with extraordinary specificity, and sometimes, more often than not, with symbolic content that actually requires your interpretation. And a common feature of these dream transmissions is that the details fade quickly upon waking. You might remember the general shape of what you received, but the specifics dissolve like morning mist. The implication for secrecy, of course, is interesting. If you can't fully remember what you did, you can't fully share it, you can't fully replicate it. The forgetting is built into the transmission. The spirit has ensured through the nature of the gift itself that the knowledge stays protected. And then, back to the cases where the spirit is simply explicit. Don't share this, don't write this down, don't speak this aloud outside of the working itself. The secrecy is part of the pact, part of the agreement between you and the spirit, and it's a condition of the relationship. Obviously, how counterproductive would it be if I go into great detail on this part, but you need to have that relationship and that experience for yourself. Breaking this agreement, of course, has consequences. It can break the working itself. The spirit who gave you the knowledge may withdraw their cooperation. The working may stop functioning. The relationship, of course, may sour in ways that are very difficult to repair. Maybe the spirit will actively even turn against you because this knowledge was a gift that now has become a weapon. They're sort of like, hey, what the fuck? That's mine. Like, you know, Okay, so now I want to sort of like flip completely and talk about the modern landscape because I think there is a conversation that needs to happen about what's actually being shared online and what isn't. And I want to, have it, of course, without shaming anyone because I'm literally a witch with a podcast talking about not blasting it out there. How fucking ironic. But obviously, there's a value of community and visibility. I myself am learning that as someone who actually never dipped a foot into the online occult space until recently. But what you see on your witch talk, on your Instagram, on YouTube, the spell jars, the altar setups, even stuff in books, the spell with me videos, the aesthetic flat lays of magical ingredients. That is, of course, not the working. At least if the witches are worth their salt more intelligently, what you see may be a finished working, one where the secrets of the procedure are not shared. They cannot even be looked at or even thought of, or it was more or less spirit approved, or it was a display, copy, or decoy of the working entirely, fixed for the consumption of media, changed wording, changed ingredients, changed steps, and I think this is actually important for newer practitioners to understand because there's a tendency to think that if you replicate the spell jar exactly, if, oh God, fucking smart spell jars, but if you use the same ingredients in the same proportions, if you follow the steps precisely, you'll get the same results. And this is why it's really important to actually do the work, build the relationships with your materia, your spirits in these correspondences, change the petition, use your words, the real working, the one that the has the practitioner's specific energy, their specific relationships, their specific knowledge. That's not on the video. This, of course, isn't really gatekeeping, this is magical hygiene. And understanding it actually frees you because it means you don't have to share everything to be valid. You don't have to perform your practice for an audience. You don't have to document every working to prove that it happened. And very apparently now, witchcraft has become an certain corners of the internet and the marketplace an aesthetic, a brand, a product. You know, my podcast is a brand, and the logic of branding and product development is fundamentally at odds with the logic of magical secrecy. Brands need visibility, of course, products need marketing, and aesthetics need to be seen. And so, of course, there's this pressure. It's subtle, but it's real. To share more, to document more, to make your practice visible and legible and appealing to an audience, to turn your altar into this content making machine, and to turn your workings into actual tutorials. It sort of makes you feel like your spiritual life needs to be turned into a feed, especially if you're participating in these online spaces. So this actually isn't new, right? The commodification of magical knowledge has been a concern for as long as magic has been practiced. The grimoire tradition's insistence on limited copies and proper transmission was partly a response to the fear that magical knowledge would be commercialized, mass produced, stripped of its context, and sold to anyone with the money to buy it. And in a sense, that's actually exactly what happened. The grimoires were eventually printed, the secret knowledge was published, and the hidden names were made public. And the traditions that depended on secrecy for their efficacy had to adapt or die. Now, of course, there are some very well kept secrets within the magical space, but some have adapted, some have died, some went deeper underground, and some found new forms of secrecy within the new landscape of availability. So we're in a similar moment now. The internet has made magical knowledge more available than ever before. Anyone with a phone can access spells, rituals, invocations, and recipes online. The barriers to entry have never been lower, and in many ways, of course, this is wonderful. It means people who might never have found the craft can find it, can learn, can practice, and can, of course, connect with others. But it also means that the ecology of magical knowledge has been disrupted in some ways. Knowledge that was meant to be transmitted carefully in relationship with proper preparation is now floating freely in a context that has none of those safeguards. And the question of what's lost in transition is worth asking. So, of course, I'm not saying everyone who shares their practice online is doing something wrong. I'm not saying there's no value in community and visibility. And the kind of connection that happens when practitioners find each other online. There absolutely is. And of course, I'm a part of this ecosystem now. But I think it's worth asking yourself honestly. When I share something about my practice, am I sharing it because it serves the work, because it serves the community, because it's genuinely safe to share and genuinely useful to others? Or is there a shadow side to it? Are you sharing it because you want to be seen, you want validation, because the silence feels uncomfortable and filling it with content feels better? So, of course, this is worth being honest about because the magic doesn't care about your follower account. The magic cares about the container, and if you're creating your container for visibility, you're making a choice that has magical consequences. So there's my little stupid rant on that side of things. When it comes to the actual practice of sealing these workings and keeping your motherfucking mouth shut sometimes, no, just kidding. But for workings, learning from, the folk tradition of ways and how secrecy was so deeply rooted is inspirational. So, of course, you can seal your workings after they've been performed. Close them off, lock it down, make it inaccessible to outside interference. This is very much like the set it and forget it, especially when those like gurus online are like, oh, forget your manifest, like manifest something and like forget you talked about it or you forget you thought about it. But actually, when we do spells, we kind of do this, right? Like we charge all of our energy, we send it off with a big bang, and then you are to forget about it, to allow it to manifest the way you intended in the universe. In practical terms, this might look like a physical act of closure, so like tying knots, sealing a jar, burying something, burning something. The physical act mirrors the magical intention. It's this disposal of your spell. This is, it's done, it's closed, and it's no longer accessible, or it's set to manifest. It's like setting your horse off to the races. So very commonly we see, of course, burning things, and to me this is not so much as like closing the working. This is more like that setting the horse off to the race. It's setting it free, it's allowing it, it's alchemizing it, it's transmuting it, and I would love to do an episode on fire, but anyway, you could also seal with wax in, other traditional methods like dripping wax over your folded petitions or over your jars, over a knotted cord. The wax, creates a physical seal that mirrors the magical seal. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. The working is now contained. So this actually can get further into the weeds a little bit when it comes to sealing that involves misdirection. So creating something for curious eyes to find that isn't the real working, something that looks like the thing but isn't the thing, something that satisfies the curiosity of whatever is looking without exposing what actually matters, whether this is other practitioners, other people, spirits. When it comes to this misdirection, the use of mirrors, shiny things, and reflective surfaces are quite an obvious one. A mirror can be placed strategically, physically, or energetically, can redirect attention away from what you want to protect. The curious eye, sort of lands, create something for this curious eye to land on the mirror and it sees itself reflected back. It doesn't see what's behind the mirror, it doesn't see what you're actually doing. So these sort of like reflective objects can also be used as portals, a window, a tool for seeing and being seen, or for controlling who sees what. And this can be combined with like surveillance work. So using the mirror not just to deflect, but to see who's looking. A mirror that reflects can also show you what's approaching. So combined with, of course, the right allies, spirits or servitors, whose function is to watch and report, a mirror becomes both a shield and like a window. You can see out without being seen in. Now, of course, you could use witch bottles or jars, and they can be used really for all sorts of intentions. For a secrecy jar, you're containing the work itself, maybe, or more precisely, you're containing the silence around the working. You're creating a physical object that holds the intention of secrecy, that acts as a magical lock on the information that you want to protect. What you put in it, what you seal it with, what you do with it after, those are all details that I'll leave up to you. But I'll say, mirrors inside jars are particularly interesting for this purpose. A jar that reflects inward keeps what's inside contained. It's sort of like this spirit trap. A jar that reflects outward deflects attention from the jar itself, or could act back as that sort of surveillance mechanism. So, protecting your written records too. You can obviously your grimoires, your journals, you could use protective inks, and you can use special parchment, all that good stuff. Even taking inspiration from the Key of Solomon, like wrapping it in consecrated or bewitched and enchanted cloths, rituals performed over it to protect it from unauthorized eyes. It can be also very practical, keeping your records in places where they just won't be casually found, using language that's meaningful to you but opaque to others, developing your own system of notation that functions as a personal cipher, or if you want to write your entire grimoire in fucking pig Latin, then go for it. Okay, well, let's finally wrap this thing up with some talk on discernment because, for deciding what's actually safe to you to share and what needs to stay silent, where does this line of secrecy really begin? Where does it end? Because not everything needs to be secret. Some things are genuinely meant to be shared and, serve the community, lose nothing by being spoken aloud. And the question is how to tell the difference. Well, of course, there are three pretty major or highlighted, I guess, ways you can use to discern here. And it's just that gut level sense of whether something wants to stay close or wants to go out into the world. Use your intuition. Sometimes you can feel it in your body, something might tighten when you think about sharing a particular piece of knowledge, or your body actually physically hesitates. And then maybe sometimes your brain fights that and you say it anyway, but you can recognize where that hesitation starts. Now, you can obviously always consult with your spirits, checking in about whether sharing something is appropriate, whether it violates any agreements, whether it serves the work or just serves your ego. Then, of course, you can rely on good old divination practices. Pulling your cards or using whatever divination method you are most comfortable with or what you prefer to get a read on whether sharing is appropriate. This is particularly useful when your intuition is sort of unclear. So, like when your head's fighting your heart, and when you're too even emotionally invested to trust your gut. So, finally, secrecy in magic is not shame. At its core, it is not shame when it comes to the magic. There are useful reasons for secrecy in magical traditions, and the reason it is not because you are afraid of what people will say or think, or because you are ashamed of the magic you execute. I thought this topic would be interesting mostly because a witch on a podcast on the internet talking to you about keeping your practice secret. I of course see the irony, and I wanted to be able to start that conversation for others too. You know, maybe you think you're being secret because you're being mysterious, but actually, when you look inward, it's because of a deeper shameful reason, and that's something for you to work through, or it makes you double think about where you want your secrets to lie within your own practice, or maybe you will start to feel less shameful for being secret because there are plenty of good reasons for it. And of course, I'm not telling you to hide. I'm not telling you to be ashamed. I'm not telling you to go back into, quote, a broom closet and pretend you're something you're not. If you have found community online, if you've, you know, been open about your practice and it's connected you to people who understand you, if you just calling yourself a witch out loud was the first time you felt like yourself, of course, do not give that up. That matters. That's real. And I obviously, share that identity with you. But the key here is there's a difference between being visible and being exposed. There's a difference between this community and exhibition. You can be an out witch and still have secrets. You can talk about your path and still keep your working silent. You can share your altar and still never share what you whispered over it. You can be fully, proudly, publicly yourself and still have a locked room inside your practice that no one enters but you and your spirits. So, in a world, of course, that demands constant sharing, constant visibility, constant performance. Choosing silence is sort of this truly magical act. It's this reclamation of something that practitioners have engaged in always, and it's essential that the noise of modern life has been trying to drown out. So, when you think about secrecy in the craft, just know that there is a lot more to it than just keeping your pipe shut. Think about it. Think about the ways that it sneaks in, or the ways that you can use it to your ultimate advantage to be a more cunning sorcerer. So, I hope this conversation today was interesting for you, and I hope you stayed to the end. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Our little family here is growing and it's awesome. I love it. It means the world to me. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.